Okay, I'm for those who are not familiar with my image, I'm David Elwood. I teach the course on soft power and global politics. But tonight we're not going to talk about soft power or global politics, or at least not directly, because we have a very, very special guest, one of Europe's leading epidemiologists, Paolo Vineis, from Turin and London and Geneva, it must be said. Paolo Vineis has a spectacular CV, which takes 2 detailed pages to cover. He is chair of environmental epidemiology at Imperial College London, which is one of the most prominent teams in Britain working in this area, closely connected to the government, and also very prominent on radio. And he leads the exposome and health theme of the MRC Centre for Environmental Health at Imperial College. Currently, he's visiting professor at the Italian Institute of Technology. Prof. Vineis is a leading researcher in the fields of molecular epidemiology and exposomics. His latest research activities mainly focus on examining biomarkers of disease risk, complex exposures, and intermediate biomarkers from omic platforms in larger epidemiological studies, as well as studying the effects of climate change on non-communicable diseases. He has over 930 publications, which is certainly a record by my standards. Many as leading authors in journals such as Nature, Nature Genetics, Lancet, Lancet Oncology. He's a member of various international scientific and ethics committees and vice chair of the ethics committee of the International Agency for Research on Cancer. He's extensive experience in leading international projects. He's written several books, including philosophical books on the dawn of probability, Einaudi, models of risk, both in Einaudi, leading Italian publisher, Health Without Borders, Epidemics in the Year of Globalization. This is 2017. Health Without Borders, Epidemics in the Year of Globalization. That came out in 2017. And Prevenire, Preventing, with Luca Cara and Robert Cingolani, also Einaudi. So it's an exceptional occasion, exceptional opportunity to hear from one of Europe's leading experts in this area at a moment of extreme difficulty, extreme danger, extreme crisis in the pandemic we're all going through. Over to you, Paolo.
Thank you very much, David, for the kind introduction. Well, I can explain later why I have so many publications, because this is essentially collaborative work, which involves hundreds of different researchers in the world.
Okay.
But in any case, now I will try to share my screen, which is usually one of the most difficult steps.
Exactly.
Okay, yes, it seems to work. Can you see my screen?
No,
yes.
No, I totally agree. It is one of the most tricky points. Yeah, go right ahead, Paolo.
But can you see it? Can you see the screen?
Yes, certainly. Yes, yes.
Good, yes. All right, so my title is COVID Information and Decision Making. What I want to do is to try to describe the different steps that lead from the provision of scientific information, evidence, to decision making in a kind of critical way. And I will introduce you to some of the underlying science and reasoning. So, okay, these are the 4 topics I will cover, but obviously there will be time for discussion and interaction. First, preparedness, what is called the preparedness and the use of predictive models for decision. I will address some historical examples, particularly about geopolitics. Then a very good example of political debate has been herd immunity, as you may have noticed. And then I will say something about vaccines and geopolitics. So first of all, we know that there are emerging infections. This is an image from Fauci. You may know, he is one of the main virologists in the United States. He has been an advisor for different presidents of the United States already in the Ebola period. And this image shows the emerging in red, the newly emerging infectious diseases, the re-emerging infectious diseases, those which were not epidemic, but they came back for different reasons, and also the deliberately emerging diseases due to bioterrorism. Now, Fauci is very cautious, prudent, but he suggests in this very nice paper that came out last year in Cell that there is in fact an increase in the frequency of epidemics and emerging diseases in the world. Now, I will not go into the explanations of why or hypotheses or theories of why pandemics are emerging or re-emerging. Well, many of you certainly know that things like agriculture, animal breeding, deforestation, international trades, transportation, and so on are involved, but this is not the topic of my presentation. Just a few words about preparedness to give you some feedback to understand the following reasoning. So, first of all, this epidemic was not completely unexpected. You know that we had previous epidemics like SARS and MERS, which were caused by coronaviruses. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, already hypothesized that there could be a pandemic due to an unknown pathogen, which was called disease X. And in fact, the head of the medical center in Rotterdam, Erasmus University, claimed that COVID-19 is disease X. However, all epidemics are different. This needs to be taken into account because it is relevant to preparedness. For example, this is a list of viral diseases with different characteristics. One is R0. You have learned every night they broadcast the RT, which is the number which is used to take measures and control the effectiveness of measures. R0 is, well, the first measurement of infectiousness and ability of the virus to spread in a naive population before anyone is before anyone is infected, and when everyone is susceptible, the totality of the population is susceptible before any containment measure. And you see that R0 is 1, 2 for seasonal flu, but it goes up to 12 or 18 for measles. It means that each infected person can infect another person if R0 is 1, or it can infect 12 to 18 people if R0 is 12 to 18, like in the case of measles. And also lethality figures are extremely different. Seasonal flu is just 0.1%, whereas it goes up, lethality goes up to 25 to 90% for Ebola. And it was pretty high for SARS and MERS as well, 9 to 16% or 30 to 40%. Well, I cannot go into many details, but this is just to explain that preparedness needs to take these figures into account. You can have a rapidly spreading disease like measles with low lethality, or a disease with slow spread, but very high lethality, like in the case of MERS. One of the key issues for the spread of an infectious disease is mobility of the population. Mobility means trades, it means transportation, movements of people. This is an Italian example. It is how mobility affected the number of cases in the first wave of the epidemic in Italy. The number of the cases by region was, I'm talking about COVID-19, obviously, was much greater when the lockdown was delayed or was late compared to the first onset of the epidemic. So in the first wave, there were few cases in southern Italy because lockdown measures were timely, simply because the epidemic started in the north. But in general, mobility is certainly one of the main determinants of the spread of an epidemic or a pandemic. Now, how can we predict the spread of a disease, and what are the prediction models? What is inside this black box of prediction models? You have seen many prediction models, starting with those provided by Neil Ferguson at Imperial College in February and March 2020. These are based on very complex algorithms, and I will try to, well, first say a few words on what are these models, and then what is inside, what are the elements that feed the algorithms. So one type of model is called SIR, or SEIRS. That is, you have to imagine the population as made by compartments, and the compartments are susceptible, which is 100% of the population before the infection arrives. Before we received the virus, so to say, in Italy, everybody was susceptible. Then you have the exposed people, because not everyone is exposed. You have the infectious. Once people have got the infection, they become infectious. Recovered, or people who die from the infection, and susceptible again in case immunity does not last. So recovered may become again susceptible. And there are transition rates which characterize the transition between compartments. So each of these compartments is characterized by different transition rates. And this is at the basis of algorithms that are used. A second type of model is called agent-based model, which simulates the actions of individuals. And I will show you some, like wearing a mask, social distancing, or all the measures we know about. Then you have what are called the phenomenological models. Well, for those of you who are economists or sociologists or social scientists, these should be familiar, because these are based on equations that describe how the epidemic moves. For example, Ebola moves according to this relatively simple logistic curve. So what I want to do now is to try to go inside the box of the algorithm using the prediction made by Ferguson and Dorigatti for Italy, using the Imperial College model on April the 5th, 2020. So they fed their algorithm, which was an SIR model, with different assumptions and data. And when you evaluate the impact and the results of the model, you have to consider, first of all, the assumptions that have been made, and also obviously the quality of the data. So they assumed an incubation period of about 5 days, which was correct. If infectiousness was assumed to be to start 0.5 days before symptoms, which was also correct, half a day, 1 day before symptom onset. Well, the third point is a little more complex. We know that the distribution of infectiousness is not even in the population, is not homogeneous. But there is what is called overdispersion, which means that some individuals are super spreaders. It is usually said that 20% of the individuals are responsible for 80% of new cases. So the distribution of infectiousness is skewed, and this is called overdispersion that needs to be fed into the model. Then that was a mistake. They assumed that 2/3 of the infections were symptomatic, which is in fact not true. It is clearly the opposite. There are many more asymptomatic people than symptomatic. So there was a wrong assumption in the model. And then they used 3.1 as R0 that was estimated in Lombardy. And on this basis, they predicted how many cases would arise in Italy, and also the impact on hospitalization and deaths by age group. So they predicted how many cases would require hospitalization and how many of them would die, based on, once again, on assumptions that often came directly from Wuhan, from China, because since we didn't experience COVID before in Italy, we had to rely upon the previous experience of Wuhan. So I'm saying all this because it is important to realize that when policy decisions are made, they are based on models which have assumptions at their basis, which means that not only you can make errors, mistakes in predicting the number of cases, the number of hospitalizations, and so on, but also these models are sensitive sometimes to small changes in the assumptions. So the assumptions should be discussed in a way with decision makers. And this is a model that colleagues of mine have prepared for the Piedmont region, in the area around Torino. This is a little more complicated because they have also made assumptions about the matrices of contacts, which are those squares in blue. That is, they made assumptions on how frequent contacts per day would occur, depending on the context, home, other, school, work, and the age group. And then they built this model, which is, as I said, more complicated than others, to estimate cases and hospitalizations and deaths, once again. So you see that the assumptions you make are quite important. And just in the current period, we should have good measures for the metrics of contacts for different contexts and for different age groups, to know, for example, what is the contribution of schools, what is the contribution of the work-related contacts. So my colleagues at the University of Torino have used that model to make this kind of predictions with some additional assumptions, which are the effectiveness of containment measures. So in this case, the use of masks, a decrease in contacts in general, including the lockdown in a certain period, the closure of schools or of shops, and so on. And so what you see there is the proportion of decrease in contacts, 20%, 40%, 60%, and the different numbers of daily cases, infected cases. And depending on those assumptions, you have a dramatic increase in the cases or a much more limited number of cases if you have a very high effectiveness of containment measures. And also here you have the detection rate, because the detection rate means whether or not you have contact tracing of the subjects, of the contacts, and you identify less or more new cases per day. Okay, so those were just examples of the impact of assumptions. And if you are interested in knowing more, I have written with a number of colleagues, including Italian and English colleagues, a paper in Nature that is called 5 Ways to Ensure That Models Serve Society. And there we essentially we make 5 points, which is mind the assumptions, which was what I was telling. Mind the hubris, which means don't be too bold in say, considering the results of your model true or too strong compared to in relation to the assumptions and the quality of the data they rely upon. Mind the framing, which is what are the models for in terms of decision making. Mind the consequences. If you change a little bit the assumptions, what are the consequences also in terms of decision making? And mind the unknowns. And the unknowns may be a lot, because very often we know little, for example, about the metrics of contacts. Even now, we know very little about how the infection spreads through schools, through working places, through supermarkets, and so on. So unfortunately, there is a big disproportion between assumptions and real data, for example, for the metrics of contacts. Now, I mentioned some examples from the past. Because certainly it's not the first time we deal with similar problems. And in history, we encounter a mixture of scientific problems, epidemiological problems, political problems, and ethical problems. For example, there is a very nice PhD dissertation by Catherine Olivarius in Oxford about yellow fever in New Orleans in the 19th century, showing that the population was divided between those who were acclimated to the risk of yellow fever, that is immunized, and everyone else. And the former could marry, work, and even change their market value, particularly for slave. So this led to a social stratification. And she coined the term immunocapital. Everyone, particularly people who were acclimated, had their own immunocapital. Even now, there is a social stratification of COVID. This is a huge piece of research done in the United Kingdom called Open Safely, showing that people in the most deprived quintile have a risk of death. These are deaths from COVID, which is twice as high as the least deprived. And also Blacks and the general minorities had a higher risk of COVID infection, and particularly of poor outcomes like death. And another example of political, a mixture between scientific and political issues is cholera in Hamburg at the end of the 19th century, which is an example of a conflict between a central authority and local authority. Because Hamburg was ruled by a merchant class with the characteristics of the Hanseatic League. They were not confident in the central power. I think this reminds you of something happening today. They opposed the containment measures based on economic reasons and arguments because of their traits. And Koch, Robert Koch, was sent by the emperor, and at the end, the containment measures were implemented, but it took some time, and there were almost 9,000 deaths in 6 weeks. Another example is the Suez Canal, which is again a topic we are talking about today. When it was opened, there was an international commission for the control of cholera, which ordered the quarantine to the British ships. But the British claimed it was a violation of the Free Trade Act, and they claimed that cholera was an excuse to block the British trade, particularly by the French. So epidemics have been used in different ways in a geopolitical context. Now, I want to go through the example of herd immunity, because it is once again an example of the intersection between politics and policy and science. It is a very delicate topic, because we don't know if we will reach herd immunity through the vaccines. We can discuss that later. There are several reasons why we might not reach herd immunity. But in any case, at a certain point last summer, in September, people from Brazil claimed that Manaus and in general the Amazon area had reached herd immunity, because the proportion of people who had got COVID-19 was 60%, which has been considered approximately the proportion of infected people needed to reach the herd immunity. Well, ironically enough, you may know that there has been another big epidemic in Manaus recently, because of a mutation, the famous Brazil variant, which is pretty bad. It is very contagious and very aggressive and deadly. So they claimed that herd immunity was reached, but in fact there was a variant that led to another wave recently. So I said that this is a political, politically relevant topic, because there have been literally completely opposed points of view. There was last year the Great Barrington Declaration. I don't know why it is called like that. But it was a group of scientists who said that, you know, the argument, SARS-CoV-2, you certainly know that SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the virus and COVID-19 is the name of the disease, should spread among the young people. Only the elderly people should be protected to reach herd immunity quickly. So they hypothesized a very clear divide in the population between those who should be protected and all the others, among whom the virus should spread to reach the herd immunity, based on completely understandable arguments like not punishing too much economic activities. But there was a response in the Lancet from people who said that this was this idea of herd immunity was a dangerous fallacy unsupported by scientific evidence. And I think that after several months, the latter group was right for reasons I will not explain, but Manaus is an obvious example. You may have a variance, for example. Okay, and by the way, the examples of herd immunity we know have a completely different nature, and they are probably not applicable. Okay, I probably jump. Yeah, I don't want to bore you with technical details about herd immunity or RT, R0. If you are interested, we can go back on those slides. I want to however, stress the importance of super spreaders, people who give a greater contribution to the spread of the infection compared to the average individual. So most of the models suggest that it takes 60 to 70% of the population to become infected to reach herd immunity. But the infection is not spread evenly in the population. Well, in addition to Manaus in the first phase, there is another example in the first wave of a very large proportion of people being infected, which is the San Quentin State Prison in California. Also there, more than 60% of the population was infected. But we cannot generalize this approach, Manaus or San Quentin, to the totality of the population. If this approach of the herd immunity had been used in the United States, 1 to 2 million people would have died. So essentially it is unfeasible. Even in Sweden, you know that in Sweden they theorized originally the idea of the herd immunity. Then they changed their mind. Well, Sweden had last year 10 times the number of COVID deaths per 100,000 people compared to the neighboring countries, Norway in particular, but also Finland has a very small number of cases. So Sweden is not certainly a good example. And it has a pretty high overall cumulative mortality rate. Okay, so so far I showed a few examples of intersection between science, models, assumptions, different views, and politics and decision making, including different views, which are both scientific and policy-making views, like the Swedish approach, the Great Barrington Declaration. Now, just a couple of slides, my final slides, about, once again, geopolitics, but also different models of science to policy transfer. China has been leading the global race in vaccine development in 2020. It developed a vaccine as early as in February last year, starting phase 1 clinical trials in March, and they published the results in late May, so they were very early. And a kind of icon of China's vaccine development is General Chen Wei, who led the vaccine development operations. And he celebrated such achievements, saying that it is an embodiment of our country's science and technology progress, an embodiment of China's great power, image, and responsibility, and even more, a contribution to humankind. Now, it is clearly an example of soft power that is, well, presenting the vaccine as a contribution to humankind, which, however, is not free of charge, because essentially in Africa and in other parts of the world, it is against access to resources.
Paolo.
See?
Paolo.
They have even talked about the Health Silk Road as a component of the Belt and Road Initiative. And just a final slide about the United States. Also, the United States have had different approaches, depending, obviously, as we know, on the president in charge. Initially, they chose a nationalist route instead of a soft power approach. And they opted out of the COVAX facility, refusing to commit vaccine aid internationally. But then Joe Biden has made different choices by joining COVAX. And the Biden administration sent a strong message around the United States is back as a global health power. So I know this is very, if you like, very superficial, but it is just to show how different superpowers address geopolitics, and Europe may be still a different example, and it was, by the way, the first to launch the COVAX network. I stop there, and I'm open to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you very much. Can we see you?
Yeah, right, yes.
You can switch off your slides. Ah, there we are, yes. Excellent.
Yes.
Very
Okay.
good. Yes, indeed. Good, we've got some excellent materials for discussion from now on. We have plenty of time. Is there anybody who would like to start the discussion? Anybody who would like to throw a question, either the chat mechanism or opening their computer?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll start it off then in the simplest way possible. Why is it called COVID and why is it number 19?
Yes. COVID comes from coronavirus. Well, 19 because it started in 2019 in Wuhan. So there is a kind of arbitrary denomination of vaccines, of viruses and diseases. So COVID is coronavirus disease. Yeah.
Which was COVID number 1?
No, 19 is the year. The year in which...
Oh, the year. Oh, right.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, it's the year.
2019, because
yes.
It started in 2019. Yeah.
But is there an idea among you and your colleagues of how many coronaviruses there are?
Oh, I think they might be hundreds, but it depends very much on how you count them. I mean, you have many variants within the family. So they might be hundreds, but the problem is that we don't know how many viruses are there. We only know a small proportion.
Yeah.
An estimate is that there is 1.6 million viruses, but only a small proportion of them is known.
I see. What's your, even today in the newspapers, there is controversy about the origins of COVID-19. Once again, the question of animals and wild animals, animal trade comes up in the Chinese context. What's your perspective on that? What's your idea about that, the origins of it?
Yes. Well, first, there is no evidence that it came out of a laboratory, just to be clear, in spite of the claims, but there is no evidence. Then it comes from bats. That is a matter of fact, because bats are a reservoir of coronaviruses, and they are particularly resistant to bats, to coronaviruses. They have an immune system that has developed together with coronaviruses. I think that the particular conditions of heat and temperature within caves where the bats live is very favorable for the life of, it's not really life, but the proliferation of coronaviruses. I see that it's not really life, because a virus is something that is unable to live in its own, independently of an animal. It needs to parasite an animal to live and reproduce. And then bats are a reservoir, and they spread viruses to other animals. What is exactly the intermediate animal? It is not clear. They said that the pangolin in the Wuhan wild animal market. Other people said it was a snake, but I think that there is no firm evidence. The evidence comes basically from sequencing the viruses in these animals. That is, the same RNA sequence that you find in the human virus was found in a coronavirus coming from bats and spreading to the wild animals in Wuhan, and in pangolin in particular. But I think it is still relatively weak evidence.
How much is known about what drives and what creates the variants?
Yeah, well, essentially the speed of of spread of the virus in the population or in animals, like in animal farms. So let's take animal farms first. If you have a large number of animals living together, like in these animal farms where animals are bred for the production of meat, there is a high speed of circulation and replication of the virus. And this increases the probability of mutation. Mutations tend to be random, but if a mutation arises that gives a particular selective advantage to that strain, that will spread rapidly in the animals. The speed of circulation in larger reservoirs of animals, the greater the likelihood that mutants will appear and be selected for their selective advantage. The same applies to humans. This is the reason why everybody is concerned about the speed of vaccination all over the world, because if we have a very large reservoir of humans still susceptible to the virus circulates in this very large population, billions of people, and it is more likely that you will have mutations and selection of strains, like the Kent strain in the UK, or the Brazil strain, South African, and some of these are quite nasty, like the Brazilian one.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about animals, about the presence of virus in animals, but the coronavirus, COVID-19, doesn't kill animals. It just kills humans. Is that right?
No, it's not exactly right, because there was an epidemic of swine flu. It was in fact an hemorrhagic disease in pigs that took place in 2003, I believe, in China. It was relatively contained and limited, and it was due to a coronavirus not too different from the virus of SARS. It was not the same, but it was similar. So there are also strains of coronavirus that kill animals. It was a mass killing of pigs by this hemorrhagic.
Yeah, there was the story about the mink in Holland.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, now, yes, that reminds me, yes.
Yeah.
So were they able to block the spread of the virus by killing all the mink?
Yeah, I think so, yes. It was a very rapid initiative in the Netherlands and also in other countries where there were mink farms. I know that in Italy there are some mink farms and they are under control, in the sense that they test the minks but I believe that if they find coronavirus, they kill them.
Yeah, I see, yes. Would anybody else like to step in with a question? Here is somebody who's watching, who prefers to be anonymous. He or she asks this question: how will the emergence of the Brazilian variant and the Bolsonaro administration's poor response to the outbreak affect global relations with Brazil? Is it fair to characterize the poor response as a global security threat? And if so, is there a case for targeted sanctions against Bolsonaro and other Brazilian officials?
It's a difficult question.
Very.
Yeah, because I don't think that the word is black and white. So I agree that Bolsonaro was probably at one extreme in the response to COVID. And he was certainly responsible for the rapid spread and all the deaths that occurred in Brazil, particularly in the Amazon and in Manaus. So Bolsonaro has gigantic responsibilities, but there is a continuum, and it's very difficult to strike a line. I mean, the poor governments that were very ineffective, governments that were partially ineffective, and so on. Well, I agree that Bolsonaro is an extreme case, and a case could be set up against him, an international case, because it is an extreme example. Maybe yes. I might agree, yes.
Yeah, I see. Anyone else care to raise a hand or come forward with a voice, even a face? Okay. Let me carry on then with the discussion while other people are. Oh, here's number two. Here's number two. Let me see another question. Here's another question. It's also an anonymous person. Do we know how many people who have recovered from a COVID-19 infection are susceptible to reinfection? And can someone with immunity against the disease, either from previous infection or through vaccination, spread the virus further?
Yes. Well, the answer is yes to both questions, but it seems that these people are minorities. Now, it's not, as you know, very clear how long the immunity lasts. And in any case, there are two types of immunity. One related to antibodies, which is shorter, and one related to cells, T lymphocytes, which has a longer duration. So the expectation is that sooner or later, the virulence of the virus attenuates, and the disease becomes more similar to influenza from H1N1, and it becomes endemic, meaning that well, it will be milder, less deadly, but still widespread, for several reasons. One is because, as I said, immunity is not long-lasting. So it's possible that you get influenza every year, or you can get influenza. The second reason is because of mutations. Also, in the case of H1N1, which is the virus for influenza, you have mutations, which is the reason why you need to change the vaccine every year. So this was the first question. People who have got the disease or who have been vaccinated can have the disease again. Well, if the strain of the virus is the same, I mean, there are no new variants, let's suppose, it is possible that being reinfected is rare. A different issue is whether that there will be variants and mutations like for the influenza virus. Second question is whether a person who has got the disease or the vaccine can infect other people. Also there, the answer is yes, and it is not a common phenomenon, probably. The current view is that through the vaccine, you have three potential types of response, depending on the entity of the immune response. If the immune response is very strong, you will not spread the virus because you don't have any virus in your throat. So you will not be contagious. If the immune reaction is mild, you will not have the worst clinical outcomes. So in any case, the vaccine protects you from hospitalization and the worst symptoms. But you can still spread the disease because you still have the virus in your throat. So it's really manifestation of the entity of the immune response.
Okay, here's another question which has come up. This is from Paolo Vineis. You mentioned USA and China as a decision-making different responses. How about the role played or a different approach taken by Europe, presumably meaning the European Union? Now you get into very complex questions, the relationship between biochemistry, epidemiology, and politics. Do you feel like confronting that question?
Yeah,
the different kinds of response offered by the authorities in China, US, Europe, and Europe.
Yes. Probably one could say that the three types of responses reflect the three different natures of governments and political systems in those countries, because China has been more effective, not only because they developed a vaccine early, but I don't know whether the vaccine is really effective, because information from China is not as transparent as from other countries. So in the United States and in Europe, we have these regulatory agencies like EMA in Europe, which really go through all the documentation for drugs and vaccines, and they protect the citizens and the consumers. We don't know much about China from that point of view. So China was early in the development of the vaccine, but whether or not it is comparable to our vaccines, I cannot say. And also in tackling the epidemic through contact tracing, say, or lockdowns, China as an authoritarian regime was very effective, but simply because of the measures that were authoritarian, like implemented by the army and so on. United States might be another example if we refer to the Biden era, because it puts together a democratic approach plus efficiency in the distribution of the vaccine, which builds upon the pretty good public health system, which is traditional in the United States. And the same applies to a certain extent to the UK, in the sense that the UK performed pretty bad in the first period, because essentially because Boris Johnson didn't listen to the scientists in the very early phase.
Including your colleagues.
My colleagues, yes. Then there was also a very bad period of poor contact tracing, because it was done by private enterprises. And in fact,
with no experience, it should, not just because they were private, because they had no experience at all.
Exactly, yes. So not everybody knows, but the cumulative mortality per 100,000 people is so far greater in the UK than in Italy, much greater, which is probably the effect of poor contact tracing, poor management of the disease before the vaccine. Right, and now the UK is doing very well with the vaccine, once again, thanks to the NHS, the very good organization of NHS. And coming to Europe...
The National Health Service, NHS is the National Health Service. Yes. In Britain. Yeah. One of my British friends says it works because the NHS is running the vaccine program and not the government.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, because there is a long tradition of strong tradition of structures, preventive structures in the NHS, with very good trained personnel.
Okay, let's see what else is here. Okay, there are any other questions which come to mind? Yes, what about the approach taken by Europe? Now, there's been enormous amount of controversy and criticism about the idea that the fact that the European Union tried to centralize everything and negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies, and this negotiation more or less went wrong, with each side being to blame in its own particular way. And after that, the situation seemed to get out of control completely, which is where we are now. What's your impression?
Well, I have mixed feelings because on one side, I think it makes sense to have a centralized negotiation. For example, because it is more convenient in terms of you buy many more doses, and so
the economies of scale,
yeah, there is an economy of scale, definitely. On the other side, we know that Europe tends to be a little bureaucratic, or much very bureaucratic. Yeah, it is true. Sometimes such bureaucracy is justified. Well, I know how it works from the point of view of research, the Horizon 2020 grants, for example. And at the end of the day, Europe has the best regulations like GDPR, which are very bureaucratic. So it is painful to address them and to comply with them, but in the meantime, yeah. But in the meantime, they are a guarantee for the citizens and the researchers themselves. So Europe should overcome its worst bureaucracy and keep the best of it, and also the power that it can have because of the size. Which means that, for example, there may be an economy scale coming to purchasing goods or vaccines or whatever.
Yeah. Would you like to say something about the relationship between your part of the scientific approach and the pharmaceutical companies? To what extent do you interact with the pharmaceutical companies in situations like this? And can you explain why some pharmaceutical companies, particularly AstraZeneca, made promises that they were not able to fulfill, and now it seems obvious they wouldn't be able to fulfill them?
Yeah, no, I don't know, because I don't deal at all with pharmaceutical industries. I work in public health, and I was not involved at all in anything that had to do with vaccines purchasing, for example. So my feeling, my feeling is that this is also a reflection of how science has developed in the UK in particular in the last 20 years. And you have light and shadows, because on one side, the UK is very strong scientifically. And we see that from many signals, like the fact that they are able to monitor, to follow up all the vaccinated people, and they are always the first to come up with papers based on serological measurements, immunogenicity of the vaccines, and so on. So they have a very good records, registries, linkages, information systems. On the other side, science in the UK is very much connected to business. For example, Imperial College itself has had strict relationships with GlaxoSmithKline, for example.
Which is the biggest British pharmaceutical company.
Exactly, yes. So AstraZeneca, you have a lot of spin-offs in UK universities. And AstraZeneca is probably a typical example. That is, you have the Oxford University, you have all this wonderful, these wonderful teams of research, but then you also have the commercial side, which may not be as strong as the scientific component. For example, the development may be weaker, but particularly, well, in such a situation which was completely new and required very quick decisions and implementation of production.
Yeah, so obviously, the time schedule, the time horizon of the researchers is different from that of the business operations, the pharmaceutical companies, just rhythm and timing. Anyway, here's another question. Our anonymous participant asks this: following the previous questions regarding EU-level policy coordination, what are the prospects for the AstraZeneca vaccine following the recent suspensions of its use? Is this just alarmism, or are the risks associated with this vaccine significant enough to justify the suspension? If the latter is true, how will it impact future vaccination efforts?
No, there is no reason why it should be suspended unless something happened in recent hours that I don't know.
There was a lady who died in Palermo, who's provoking some questions.
You mean today or last week?
Well, she's in today's newspaper.
I didn't know about that. But did she die from thrombosis? Venous?
Well, apparently, in the post-mortem, there were signs of the presence of the vaccine, but I don't know with what function or with what effect anybody.
Okay. Well, I cannot say anything about this particular episode, but referring to the discussion that took place last week and 2 weeks ago, what happened was that there were, as you know, probably 7 cases of deep thrombosis in the brain, which is a rare associated with thrombocytopenia. And this is a very rare condition, extremely rare. And the mistake that was made was to consider all thrombosis together, deep vein thrombosis, which are many because they're frequent in the population. But when people counted the expected number in the vaccinated, there were many millions of vaccinated at that time with AstraZeneca. The number that was observed with deep vein thrombosis, the regular deep vein thrombosis, was the number expected was even greater than the number observed. So there were even fewer deep vein thrombosis in the vaccinated than you would expect from a non-vaccinated population. In spite of that, those 7 cases in young women below the age of 50 with thrombosis in the brain and thrombocytopenia, those might be due to the vaccine, but it is an extremely rare condition that does not justify suspension. In fact, EMA decided to go ahead and not to suspend the vaccine. There was an almost infinite ratio between the benefits and the risks. Yeah. But I don't know about this woman from Palermo.
No, I didn't go into the details of the story. But can you say anything more about the problems of producing the vaccine and why they seem to be more problems than expected, particularly in the case of AstraZeneca? We do know that making vaccines this level of complexity is very difficult and involves transnational supply chains with various different components, interdependencies. But do you have any clear idea of why AstraZeneca got into such difficulties?
No. I don't have a clear idea. I know that there are so many components coming from all countries in the world. So there may be an issue with the transport and even the production of components coming from different parts of the world, but how this affects AstraZeneca in particular compared to Pfizer or Moderna or whatever, I cannot say. I don't know why AstraZeneca is particularly affected.
No. What's your impression of the story of the Russian vaccine? It took until last Tuesday before President Putin himself got vaccinated, and he did in private. A man who's usually happy to take his shirt off in public.
Yeah.
The Russians are making a big play of this vaccine, and it's being taken up in various parts of Europe, including, as we now know, in the region of Campania, around Naples, by the regional governor. He's importing Russian vaccines. What impression does it make on you to see this sort of thing happening and this kind of fragmentation?
Well, yeah, I don't know how the Campania president can import the Russian vaccine, Sputnik, because it is not approved by EMA yet. So how does it work?
The European Medicine Authority, that's the Central European Medicine Authority, yeah.
Exactly. I believe that it is illegal to use a drug in Italy which is not approved by EMA, European Medicine Authority, and by AIFA, which is the Italian Medicines Authority. So I don't think that the president of Campania can use it. And concerning Sputnik itself, well, it is very similar to AstraZeneca in terms of composition, because it is DNA and it is based on adenovirus. The difference is that they used the two different adenoviruses, which was a clever choice. And the problem might be in the documentation, because the European Medicines Agency is very strict in getting all the documents about particularly the side effects and effectiveness. Phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of the experiments. So it took some time to approve AstraZeneca, Pfizer, and Moderna for that reason, to get all the documents. And I guess that they are still waiting for all the documents, which are even individual clinical records of people who had apparent side effects or people who died. The big question mark is the cause-effect relationship between the administration and recovery or prevention of infection, or the side effects.
Fine. Yes, exactly. Well, you're getting very dark now, Paolo. I think the sun has set, and you might have to light a candle. But at this point, if there are any more questions, I don't see any more questions coming up from our audience. I think at this point, unless you'd like to say some concluding remark, Paolo, we could.
No, well, thank you for inviting me. It might be good to hear your point of view on geopolitics and how COVID is an example of geopolitics. I told you what I know, but probably you know much more.
Well, for those who are not in my class, I have written a blog about this on the site of the School of Public Diplomacy of the University of Southern California. That came out about 10 days ago.
Okay.
That's related to the question of soft power. And your quote from the Chinese general absolutely confirms my approach to the connection between the vaccine rollout, vaccine diplomacy, and soft power, because my basic definition of soft power is the force of example, and that's exactly what your Chinese general is talking about, and is highlighting. He wishes to present this, the force of Chinese example in science and technology, and concern for humankind, and effectiveness, and all the rest of it. So it's a classic confirmation of what I believe soft power is about. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, my light doesn't work. So.
Okay, we'll let you retreat into your obscurity, and look forward to talking to you again very soon, Paolo.
In my bat cave.
You're back. Yes. Oh, very, very good. Thanks once again, Paolo.
Thank you.
I hope to be able to invite you again at some future point in the academic year. Bye for now.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thanks to everybody who's participating and listening in or watching. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.